Hey everyone, welcome back to the Unscript Podcast. I'm Matt Lynch, a co-host along with Matt Bates, Drew Johnson, Aaron Heim, Chris Tilling, and Amy Brown Hughes. This week we have a re-release of an earlier episode that I recorded with Lucy Peppiatt back a couple years ago after she published her book, Women in Worship at Corinth. And we're republishing this episode because it prepares the way for the next episode, which will make reference back to this one. So hopefully this will set the stage a little bit for the idea of Paul quoting from his opponents in his letters in ways that aren't explicit in the text, but are discernible based on maybe other clues that you can detect in the text. And Lucy discusses this with regard to 1 Corinthians 11. And there are a couple changes since this episode. Since then, she's published her IBP book, Rediscovering Scripture's Vision for Women. And also, I've moved to Regent College since then. I was a colleague at WTC of Lucy's at the time, and we're still good friends. So I'm excited to reshare this episode and hope that you can sort of store it away for the next one as well with Andrew Rillera when Chris Tilling interviews him to talk about his work on quotations in Paul's letters. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context, and we're going to jump right into the interview here. Lucy, welcome to OnScript.
Hi, thanks.
Lucy, what was your route to becoming principal of a theological college? Was that your childhood aspiration?
No, it wasn't. Nothing I've done has been my childhood aspiration.
Oh, okay.
Well, I started, when I was doing my PhD, I started doing a bit of teaching at WTC and also Trinity College, Bristol. So people were nice to me and gave me some teaching opportunities, which was great. And then I found myself in a position where there were some gaps at WTC for jobs, and I got offered the Dean of Studies job, which was a surprise. And I was pleased to take that. So I've done your job, Matt, and you've done your job.
You've done a much better job.
No, I didn't do a better job. And then WTC actually went through a funding crisis, and I found myself in the middle of that, and felt that.
Was that your childhood aspiration?
No, that certainly wasn't.
To land in the middle of a funding crisis?
Aspiration. Although it has its highs, and it's quite exhilarating in some senses, I found, because it really focuses everybody on priorities and what you actually really want. And it was a good thing. It was a very good thing for WTC for us to be thrown out on our own and have to sink or swim. And we, as you know, we gathered some amazing people around us, you being one of them.
Oh, thanks.
And we made the college, I think, into what it was meant to be, which is a very exciting place to study and teach theology.
Yeah, that it is. Did you, on your journey to getting into academics and becoming a principal, did you face any opposition to your studies in academia or leading a college because you're a woman?
No, I didn't actually. I think I've been remarkably sheltered in that regard, and it's unusual for someone not to face opposition. I think when I was studying my PhD, I used to say to Nick, my husband, that I didn't think people really knew at all what I was doing. So no one ever asked me about it. And if I mentioned it, it was kind of a conversation stopper. So not really opposition, but more slight indifference. Like, why would you bother spending all your time doing something like that when I was studying and had children, small children? But then the principal's job, again, we were, at WTC, we were very much under the radar in those years. And so I think people just slightly ignored it rather than deciding to campaign against me.
Yeah. And why did you decide to get into the study of theology in the first place?
Because I was doing a lot of preaching in our church. And in my mid-20s, I had felt that I should... I thought God was calling me to a preaching ministry, actually, which was kind of unusual at the time. There weren't many young women who were doing stuff like that in our world. And that was confirmed by my vicar, who was my uncle, and my curate, who was my husband. So it's really nepotistic there, but nice to be affirmed by your nearest and dearest. And so they said, yes, go do it. So I became a lay reader in the Anglican Church, which is a preaching ministry, and then had lots of opportunities to preach. But as I was doing that, I had this growing sense that I actually didn't really know what I was talking about a lot of the time.
It's good to be aware of that.
True, but
I wish more were.
I'm not sure much has changed, but I would listen to other teachers and listen to my husband, who'd done a whole degree, and think, actually, investing, if you're going to teach and preach, you should study. So that was the beginning, and I signed up for a bachelor's degree, which I did by correspondence while we lived in Zimbabwe and Sheffield, and then I sort of became an addict, really, as that happens, and I thought, well, I can't stop now, and went on to do a master's. And then in my master's met my supervisor, Murray Ray, and he said, you should think about doing a PhD.
The rest is history.
Yeah.
So moving on to your books on 1 Corinthians, you've written Women in Worship in Corinth, and then the follow-up to that, which is a more accessible version of it, Unveiling Paul's Women. When did you know that you had hit on something about 1 Corinthians 11 that needed more research, and that ultimately led you to write the book?
Well, I knew quite very early on, I think. I started to research women in Paul because I never actually had done. I'd done my PhD in systematic theology on Christ and the Spirit and Trinitarian theology, so which I love, and but found myself as the principal of a college and a woman, obviously, being asked a lot, what do you think about the women and the Bible? What do you think about these passages, and what do you think about Paul? And I thought, gosh, I haven't actually really thought that through. I knew I didn't have good enough answers, and so I thought I must do my own research, and I thought it would take me a couple of days of reading. Literally, I thought it'd be fine. We got some good commentaries at home because Nick collects Bible commentaries, and I can go to the library and I'll just read a few commentaries, make a few notes, and it'll be sorted. And I started with Gordon Fee because I think he's brilliant, and I thought, I'm sure he's got all the answers. So I thought, well, I'll start with 1 Corinthians 11. I know there are other passages, but let's just start there. And it was like going into a sort of vortex. I mean, I obviously read the text first and thought, it's very strange, this passage, and then turned to Fee, and it felt like I was I thought, I'm not sure that I'm clearer after that, actually. I mean, he'd done very close work, and but I thought, if I had to explain that in 5 minutes, could I do that? And realised I couldn't at all. And that I still had an awful lot of questions that I didn't think Fee had answered. So then I went to Thistleton, and then I went and that started my journey. And the more that I read, actually, the more confused I became, and the more I immersed myself in the text, the more confused I became. And then I kept reading these very big scholars and intelligent men and women who were saying this is a very confusing passage. So it took me weeks, months. It sucked me in, and I still will read the text and read about it when I can. Yeah.
And we'll talk about some of the problems you thought through in a moment, but I want to talk for a moment about the fact that you've taught this passage now for a couple years to quite a few audiences. And how do women react when they read 1 Corinthians 11 in your experience?
Well, it depends on the age group. So what I tend to do is I want people to engage with the text as they receive it to start with, because I think that's the best place to teach from. So I realized early on that with an older group of people, they are less inclined to criticize the biblical text or to admit that they have difficulties with it. And so, because what I ask them to do is to read the passage, or I read it out loud and then I ask them to have a look at it and to say, so I'll ask a gentle question, like, if Paul was here, what would you want to ask him? Something like that. If that doesn't bring anything up, in terms of trying to get them to say that there are difficulties in the text or that they find it offensive in any way, then I'll push a bit harder and sort of say, well, where are the problems? Is there anything you find offensive or difficult? So, but I found with an older group, one time I was teaching it and I said, just pretend it's not the Bible and tell me what you think. And that unleashed a whole load of response that I wasn't really prepared for. And that was the older people. If I ask a younger group of people, the young women are very vocal about how difficult they find this text, and that at best they'll say they don't understand it and look sort of kind of hurt in some ways, and then sometimes I have someone expressing real anger at Paul in a group.
Do you think that generational difference is because older women have been exposed to the text more, and so it's sort of a little hard to extricate themselves from this being in their Bible and just a normal part of things, whereas maybe younger groups have a different experience and not as much exposure?
I think that maybe it's more, there's a sort of self-selecting. I'm speaking to a group of people and those women have been in church for a long time, so they've chosen to. So I'm not speaking to people who have left and not come back because they've found the church difficult as women. So these are women they probably for quite a long time have made choices to acquiesce to certain systems that are not amenable to women often in the evangelical world, but they've made a decision that they will put God and the church first, and that they'll kind of put up with other stuff. So that years of putting up with stuff forms you into a certain type of person, and they've learned, I think, that it's easier just to give in or to receive something and not question, because I think that if you allow yourself those sort of angry responses, or you're then at odds with the people that are teaching you or you're sitting with and worshipping with, and that can be exhausting and put you on the outside. And I think a lot of women have made many sacrifices just to stay, just to be there, and like women who will go to churches where the men don't think that women should teach, and they're not really happy with that, but they want to go to church and their friends go to church and they want their kids to go to church, and so they just learn to not to question and not to allow that sort of, I guess, outrage in a sense. But with the younger crowd, and especially if they're going to churches where, their church may be led by a young woman or whatever, they don't mind so much about expressing it.
Yeah. You talk in the book about the importance of the imagination, and I thought that was interesting because for a lot of people, when they hear the imagination, they might think importing things into the text. We're going to imagine a scenario in Corinth. So what do you think is the positive or constructive role of the imagination in interpreting 1 Corinthians 11?
Well, first of all, I would say that everybody has imagined scenarios when they're reading the Bible. So it would be a complete falsehood to think that there are people who don't do that, and everybody is going to bring something they may say, oh no, but the text is telling us that this is the case. But this is the fascinating thing about the whole picture of Paul and women, is that it has fired people's imagination. The text and some of the history that we know of the early church has fired people's imaginations in completely opposite directions. And that is a really fascinating phenomenon. So it disallows us from claiming the ground of saying, the way I imagine it to be is superior to the way you imagine it to be, because somehow my imagination is well founded and yours isn't. So we all imagine, even when we hear stories about Jesus and how he reacts to people and how he treats people, we get pictures in our head about who he is and the expression on his face, and and then we read the text through that.
Yeah, tone of voice.
Yeah. And so imagination is a massively important part of how we receive our faith through the text. And so first of all, we're all doing it. And secondly, it's easier if someone's open about what this is how I imagine it to be. And actually I kind of loved that process as I was reading about 1 Corinthians 11. I was always being asked by these Bible scholars, just imagine. I was thinking, I know, but I don't imagine like you imagine. You imagine that, I don't. And as if, and once they had said, imagine this, as if then that was the reality. And I thought, that's a funny step to make. Imagine all the women chattering at once during the whole service. And I was like, actually, I can't. I think probably they wanted to hear the teaching. It's like this sort of assumption that women just gossip all the time.
And being worked up into an ecstatic frenzy.
Oh, yeah, the ecstatic frenzy one. I mean, that's, so as a woman who I think is interested in learning and reasonably intelligent, and I assume many of the women in the early church were like that, I don't necessarily want to gossip all the way through my church service. So, anyway, so the imagination is a very important part of how we receive the text. And I think a good process for all of us is to look at how is the text firing our imagination, and what have we been taught already that it actually has just been imagined and now has become a reality for us that isn't in the text.
And so as you began to imagine the situation in Corinth, what questions what aspects of the imagined scenario did you begin to question that you were reading in among commentators? So
there was one very clear disjunction that I noticed, and it was that as I was reading in the commentaries, there's a consensus that Paul is addressing men by and large in the letter of 1 Corinthians, and that it was the men that were causing problems for him. They were being divisive, and that there was so there are clues for us in the text that he is addressing the males in the church. But then you would get to 1 Corinthians 11 and 14, where there's at the end where there's also the reference to women staying silent and asking their husbands at home, and so and then suddenly they would say, well, obviously the women were being really difficult here, and I couldn't reconcile really was, so the heart of the problem with the women is that they're taking their head coverings off, and that to me did seem really odd. I mean, and it doesn't come anywhere else in the New Testament. And so, but that is really in a nutshell what the problem was. I know there are issues that some people think this is about hair. I really don't think it is. We could talk about that, but mostly I think the consensus is with the head coverings, and the people that I think have looked I don't know quite how to say this, but the people I find more convincing, let's say, are the ones who all say this is head coverings, and I find their reading of the text most convincing. And therefore, if the problem is that women are taking their head coverings off in worship, what is that telling us about the church?
Now, we spoke in the last episode of OnScript with Michael Lakey about evangelical hermeneutics and 1 Corinthians 11, and he identified a number of problems with complementarian and egalitarian readings of the text, which I thought was interesting. And you've come to similar conclusions as well, that both of the standard readings of this passage don't really work. So I'm wondering if we could just go through and identify some of the problems that you saw in the text that pose challenges to both egalitarian and complementarian readings of the text. So first of all, why do you think a cultural reading of the passage is wrong? And by that I mean saying, well, this is a cultural situation where head coverings in that society were a way of honoring people, honoring husbands, I guess. And, Paul's just speaking into that situation, but given that our culture is different, it no longer applies.
Yeah, so that would be a sort of standard egalitarian reading, I think. I don't think that the text offers that to us at all. And that's where Michael and I think the same. So you said, where did I go to, in a sense, with the text? And the key verses are verses 7 to 9, which is Michael's book is called Image and Glory. And I think that the text is telling us very clearly that there are reasons for why women should be veiled in worship, in public worship. And the reason that Paul gives, Michael thinks it's Paul, I don't think it's Paul, but the reasons that the women in Corinth are expected to be veiled during worship are theological, very clearly, and they're rooted in a creation theology, which I find difficult to reconcile to the creation theology that we find in Genesis. And this is a really interesting discussion because Michael doesn't find it so difficult to reconcile to Genesis, and I really do. So that's a good scholarly debate that I think we need to carry on having, actually, because I'm not sure we've really got to the bottom of that. I certainly don't feel I have, and I'm sure Michael would be interested in carrying on this discussion. So the verses are, for a man ought not to have his head veiled. So the issue, this is clearly the issue, that the text is saying, men, you need to not wear a veil over your head, which was common practice among Roman and Jewish men. And so they are being told in this text that they should take their head covering off in the public worship. And the reason that they're to do that is because they are the image and glory of God. But woman, so there's this sort of contrast set up between the man and the woman, and the man doesn't wear anything on his head because of his status in God, which is that he is God's image and glory. So he has a particular relationship to God, which means that he doesn't need to cover his head. Now that's kind of a mystery for us, but very interesting that this is telling us that. And so the woman, so you're like, so man, that's man's role or status before God, but isn't that woman's as well? Isn't that what we're told in Genesis? I think we are, but no, woman is actually the glory of man. So her glory, I think that how I would describe it is that the text is telling us that the woman has a derived glory or a reflected glory or something. So her glory she has her glory by virtue of her relationship with the man, not with God, and he has his relationship with God.
Yeah, it feels like a funny combination of Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Where you have the man created first, then the woman.
Yeah.
And then going back to Genesis 1 and seeing man made in the image of God, which is actually defined then as male and female, but skipping that part, taking the Adam made in the image of God, and then going to Genesis 2 and saying, well, the woman's second, and so the man has that kind of direct relationship with God, and the woman comes after, so it's derived.
Yes.
So it is a you could see how someone could cut the pieces of Genesis 1 and 2 and construct that picture, but it seems like a distorted reading of Genesis 1 and 2.
Well, and that's interesting because that is what complementarian or hierarchical readings, as I would call them, of gender relations from the text. That's exactly what they do. So, and this text gives us a sort of further window into how someone might do that, how they might take those two texts and sort of make a pastiche where man has priority and precedence, and that's what Michael sees in this text, and I see it too. So I think, well, yeah, that and that's the reason given, is that man has a privileged position in his relationship with God. Woman has a derived position from man, and then this strange connection then between the woman who has to wear some sort of symbol or sign of authority over her, and then that links us straight back to verse 3, where you have the reference to head. So your physical head is representative of your symbolic head, who in the woman's case is the man.
Yeah, let me just read verse 3. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. So you have, just to unscramble that, you have God as the head of Christ, and then Christ is the head of man, and then man's the head of woman.
Yeah, and you're reading from which?
That's the NRSV.
Yeah, that's what I've got in front of me. So we've both got husband, which actually I think is the correct translation. But in a lot of Bibles, it will just say man. So Christ is. Yeah, so this is an interesting thing. In the NRSV, Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of the wife. So they've made a decision there to use man in one sense in the first pairing, and then to change the same word into husband in the second, which is that's a big theological decision right there.
Yeah, it is.
And then God's the head of Christ. So already those editors and translators they've made a really big decision for us. And
why is that so big?
Because if you said Christ is, so you've got two other options. You could say Christ is the head of every husband, and the husband is the head of his wife. That actually, I think that's pretty Pauline. So I would be happy with that. I'd go with that, as in I would say I think that's probably what Paul thought. And God is the head of Christ. I mean, I think Paul had a very clear view of what he thought a head was, and it doesn't mean authority and rule.
So what do you think? Because I mean, to be comfortable with that is a little surprising for some people.
Comfortable with the fact that it's Paul.
Yeah,
I would describe what I think he means by head.
Yeah. Well,
which is a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Do you have a brief snapshot of that?
A brief snapshot would, I think, if you. I think that this idea that Paul uses of the husband as the kephale of the wife, it comes up in Ephesians 5, so I think it is a pretty clear. I think he taught that, but I think that what he was doing there was he was actually redefining the role of the male in the household and the husband in the household. as being a sacrificial and empowering role. I would probably put it in those would be my two main concepts that I think come through. So the husband lays down his life for his wife as Christ laid down his life for the church, but also is the cornerstone. So the other idea that's very much linked to this idea of kephale in Paul's writing, it comes up in Colossians, where Christ is the head over all things, but he's also the cornerstone. So it's like in him everything holds together. And I think that Paul understood the role of the man in that society as being, they had all the power. I mean, they literally had all the power. And with that power, I think that they were supposed to, in Paul's mind, in his view, they were called as Christian men to exercise that in a particular way, which was as one who empowers by sacrificing. So that's a radical difference between seeing head as the one who rules over and has authority. So
he uses a term that men might have nodded their heads at and then redefines it.
Yeah. I mean, he was like, well, you are the head, because they were. They that was it. They were, they ran everything. They had their households. They could do what they wanted with the people in their households. They had the right of life or death over them. They could sleep with them all if they wanted, So Paul redefining that role as a monogamous. But, if they were married, then they had to be monogamous. Everyone else was out of bounds. That's really radical. And that's your wife, and she's yours. And then their role in terms of how they should empower their wives, I think is very clear. And that also comes out in 1 Peter. So, but to go back to, so this interesting here, the verse 3 of how it's translated is important, because if in your Bibles it says, but I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, which is what it says in ours, then immediately you've got a question of, well, which man is that? Every man that's ever been created has this relationship to Christ. That's creation theology. If you say Christ is the head of every husband, then that's marriage theology and marriage and sort of gender theology. But you could say, I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman. And again, that is creation gender theology. So it's all, you have really, I think readers have to, and teachers have to make a decision about how they are going to translate those words for husband and wife and man and woman.
Now, I want to shift gears here and do a speed round. And the idea is I ask questions and you have about 3 to 5 seconds to answer them. And they can't be too well thought out. Okay, what's the most absurd interpretation of 1 Corinthians 11 that you've encountered? I know the answer to this.
This is the best question. For me personally, although I know some people take it more seriously, the oddest interpretation that I've ever heard is that the head covering symbolizes an external testicle.
Obviously.
It's self-evident.
Yeah, it is.
Actually, I think that might be hair, which is kind of even worse. Oh my word!
That is horrible.
It's really it's really horrid, and because there's also reference to semen as well, which makes it even worse.
How do people end up in that place where they're reading the Bible that way? It's very disturbing.
I don't know.
Knock knock.
Who's there?
Cow says.
Cow says who?
No, cow says moo. Knock knock.
Who's there?
A little old lady.
A little old lady who?
All this time I knew you. I didn't know that you could yodel. Okay. Knock
That's
knock.
A good one. Who's there?
Etch.
Etch who?
Bless you, my friend.
Good.
All right, what's the most significant book in systematic theology in the last 50 years?
Oh my word. You know that is an impossible question. And
it is hard.
There's only one way of being possibly able to answer that, I think, in that. So I'm going to say that Moltmann's book, The Crucified God, it was I think it represents a watershed moment in the last 50 years, a little over 50, of how the doctrine of God was reshaped post-war. And I think thinking had been going that way, obviously, but there was something about, I think, the publication of this book that was a marker in saying people are thinking differently. There was a challenge to the classical doctrine of God, which and theologians have to respond to that now in an ongoing way, and I see it in the classroom, and I hear it in sermons, and I literally, and so I think what he did and what he was expressing through that was a moment that is significant.
Where do you think we hear it most at the popular sermon level? Like, what would be a phrase that's Moltmannian in origin that we might not realize?
I think phrases like the suffering God without God in Christ, for instance, is, so I would be more comfortable with.
Right. God in Christ suffered rather than God.
Yeah. Or God.
In God's self-suffering.
Yeah. God in the flesh. So the idea of God in his essence, in his being, suffering in the same way that we suffer, because that's the assumption behind it, so that my suffering tells me how God suffers. And I think that's pretty sort of common parlance, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's made its way into biblical studies as well.
Right.
With Richard Bauckham and Terence Fretheim and others would have taken up that theme. All right, I got sucked in. I'm going to keep going the speed round. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Mustache.
Mustache who?
I'm going to stash you a question, but I will shave it for later. I botched that one. All right.
Shave it for later.
All right, knock, knock.
Who's there?
I eat mop.
I eat mop who?
That's revolting. All right. What's one idea in biblical or theological study that you think needs to die?
I think it's dying, but I definitely think the idea that biblical scholars and systematic theologians can work in isolation from each other needs to just die forever.
Yeah, I've tried it in this office, and it's not really working. All right. What have you learned through failure in your work?
I've learned that I don't like failing. I've learned an awful lot through failure in lots of areas. I've learnt, what would I say? I think it's really good to be aware of your own limitations and just to work with what you're capable of and be happy with what you're not capable of doing. And so you get a sort of much more realistic sense of your own self. I think it definitely keeps you humble. Sometimes it's a bit too crushing, and then you have to work through why have I been allowed, why have I let this really crush me, and what power have those people got over me that I feel like my failure might take me out completely. And you really, because that's silly in what I mean. It's kind of, you got to grow up, so the kind of crushing things are really good, I think, to have to get over and get through and sort out in yourself why you can't cope with any form of rejection, and kind of get healed enough to cope with people not liking you, not liking what you do, being whatever, and I think that's a good process in life.
Yeah. Who's your favorite theologian, living and dead?
Dead. I have so many favorite theologians.
You have to pick one.
I know. I hate the way you do this. It changes. Also, it changes all the time. So
You can do one with a sidekick.
One with the sidekick. I go back to Athanasius a lot. What shall I say?
Would his sidekick
today
be John Owen?
John Owen. Oh yeah, John Owen. Oh, let's say John Owen today.
Mm-hmm.
But tomorrow I might say something different.
Right, how about alive?
Alive.
Is Athanasius alive?
No, not anymore.
Okay.
Well, with the Lord he is.
Okay. Yeah, true.
I really like Catherine Tanner, and then definitely linked to that Ian McFarland, because he was her students. I like their Christology a lot.
Most overrated theologian alive. Just kidding. You don't have to do alive.
Matt Lynch.
No.
Most overrated. There's definitely a name in my head which I would not be prepared to say.
Okay. First letter of the name of that
I'm not
person?
even
Okay.
saying that.
Okay. How do you find time to write books, co-lead a church, teach, have a family, and lead a theological college? What are your time efficiency pro tips?
Time efficiency is plan everything really carefully. So I'm an inveterate planner, and I spend a lot of time planning as much as I do working, so that I know I chunk my time. I make sure I work. So I'll do different tasks at different times of the day to maximize my best thinking time, my worst times, so I have meetings, emails, thinking, writing, blah, blah, blah. And early nights and that's
early
about
mornings.
it.
Yeah.
Early mornings. Yeah, early mornings are the best, because then you don't have things.
And your early mornings are like 3 a.m.
Well, 5.
5, okay. And last one, what are the hallmarks of charismatic theology?
That's a good question. Charismatic theology, the big hallmark is this idea that human beings can be filled with the Holy Spirit. So that obviously it's an anthropological claim that God can pour out his Spirit into us as beings, like creatures, and that we somehow are receptacles of the Spirit, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. So that's a big claim about human being, and I think it's a great one, because I think it's true. And then all the theology of of the charismatic life in the Spirit kind of flows out of that. So what are the implications of that if you can be filled with the Spirit of God?
All right, shifting from the speed round, a couple more questions on the problems with 1 Corinthians 11, and I know our time's running short. One of the things that I thought that you pointed out I thought was quite interesting is the problem with verse, I don't know which one it is, but it says nature teaches that long hair is a disgrace, and this is with regard to men, and so, but you pointed out that it would be, this is from page 37 in your book, it would be very odd if it were Paul who was saying this, because he himself had long hair while he was in Corinth. And in Acts 18:18, Luke makes a reference to Paul cutting his hair when he left Corinth in relation to a vow he had made before he went there. And you figured out that his hair would have been at least 9 inches long. Mm-hmm. And so there's Paul, long-haired. If this is Paul saying this, hey guys, it's a disgrace if men have a long hair, and he's this long-haired hippie saying it. So that touches on part of your approach to this text. So what is your kind of constructive alternative to standard egalitarian and complementarian readings of 1 Corinthians 11? Right.
Yeah. So I have I reject the cultural reading. I think on good grounds, really, that I don't think that the text invites us to understand this in terms of a cultural practice. That's very problematic. Not least of all because there wasn't actually one cultural practice that everyone conformed to. So the idea that if I wore a head covering that I would offend nobody, or that if I didn't I would offend everybody, is actually not true of the culture.
Right, because you have Greek, Roman, and Jewish practices all kind of different, and so...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's lots of reasons why the cultural reading is flawed. And then the hierarchical reading actually is definitely within the text, but is theologically problematic because it's based on the idea, and Michael brings this out so clearly in his book, and I think brilliantly, is because it's based on the assumption that the woman is metaphysically subordinate to the man. That's what I mean. He brings this out so clearly, and I think his book is really brilliant. A big plug for his book.
Yeah, and it's not just she doesn't just have a role that's different than man with equal standing before God, but she's actually subordinate.
Yes, and hence the need for the covering. And that's an interesting point because we actually don't know what the covering actually means. We're not really told, apart from this concept of authority, which comes out in verse 10. Do I mean that? Yes, and the angels, of course. I mean, you wouldn't want to offend them.
Not at all.
No. So that's why I think that the hierarchical readings, or the ones that say, well, of course you should wear a head covering because you're subordinate, that's really not a good message. And the cultural one is wrong, I think. So I was sort of left with a dilemma. But then one of the things that I saw and most people see, is the flip-flopping in the passage of Paul seemingly espousing certain views in 7 to 9, and then giving us a very different view in verse 12, or starting at 11 and then 11 and 12, where suddenly it seems like, oh no, wait a minute, now you're saying, you were saying that man was related to woman like this, and now you're saying they're interdependent.
Yeah.
Because
it says in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman.
Yeah. So the commentators on the passage are divided by how severely you think the break happens at 11, whether is he contradicting himself, or is he just giving a slight tweak, or is it actually that he's continuing along his thought lines. And I and many others think that this is a contradictory statement. So he's saying one thing, then he's saying something different. So there were clues in the passage that the passage was incoherent as a piece, and that it actually has contradictions within it and problems within it that make it difficult to read it as a whole. I think most people reading it straight off will see that. They do see that. So you either have to sort of really, really try and convince someone that it works as a coherent whole. And actually, Michael's done a pretty good job of that, although he hasn't convinced me, which he knows. But and also the theological implications of what he thinks it means are just awful. But or you say, well, wait a minute, Paul is saying two different things at once. And then that took me to the point, and I heard actually Douglas Campbell talking about the whole thing of Paul using rhetorical strategies, rhetorical writing in his letters, and often citing his opponents or citing the people he disagrees with. And then I thought, of course, he does that in 1 Corinthians. He does it a lot in 1 Corinthians. And actually, it's seeming now that commentators are thinking he's doing it a lot more than we all thought in the beginning.
Yeah, so he quotes an opponent and then refutes that view.
Yeah, and anyway, that fits with the whole setting of 1 Corinthians, that we know he's engaged in discussion and dispute with the guys at Corinth. This 1 Corinthians is 2 Corinthians. So there's been some back and forth. And the more I reflected on that, the more I suddenly thought, actually, I think that he's just engaging his opponents here, and that the worst ideas in this passage are theirs. And that to me, so my book, Women in Worship at Corinth, is is taking 3 passages in 11 to 14, where I think that there's a pattern of a rhetorical argument marked by an inconsistency in meaning. So you have even blatant contradictions, like you have in 14:20 to 25 is a much clearer example of this, actually.
Yeah, and what happens there?
That's in the tongues and prophecy passage, where Paul's given you a big lead up to what he thinks tongues is and what he thinks prophecy is, and in really brilliant, I think, sort of explanation for us of what tongues is and how it functions, what prophecy is, how it functions, and this is what it's here for. And you're by the time you get to 14:20 to 25, you're fully expecting him to say, so tongues is a gift for believers or a sign for believers, and prophecy is a sign for unbelievers.
Yeah.
And he doesn't. He says exactly the opposite.
Yeah, verse 22, tongues then are a sign not for believers but for unbelievers, while prophecy is not for believers but for not for unbelievers but for believers.
Yeah. And that totally takes you by surprise, and you're thinking, but you don't mean that. You've just been saying the opposite. And then you get to the end of the 14, and he's talking about, or the end of that section, and he's talking about unbelievers walking in and saying, oh, God is really among you because you've prophesied to them.
But if all prophesy, an unbeliever or outsider who enters is reproved by all and called to account. So there it's for outsiders. So he's, there's a direct
so
contradiction
there's this
there.
switch that happens in 22, and J.B. Phillips famously thought that was just a mistake and swapped them over because it really doesn't make sense. Yeah, so let's just make it make sense. Whereas I think, well, you can't really swap them over, not really. But you could say this does make sense if you say that's what the Corinthians were thinking that Paul is correcting. So I think that he's doing it in 3 places in 11 to 14, which is all his section on worship and how we should conduct ourselves in worship, including this amazing sort of rebuke that he has for them about the poor, which is very significant, I think, because I think that the rebuke he has for them about the poor, it bolsters my understanding of how he is also rebuking them for oppressing women. So they're oppressing the women by saying, look, we're the head of you, and we're the image and glory, and you're not. And so for you not to have your head coverings on is shaming us and making us look bad in front of the angels, whatever that means. But they clearly had some quite developed angelology, actually. Yeah. And Paul also addresses that in other,
Yeah, I wanted to highlight that. So what you've done here is you've shown how there are internal contradictions within 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16 and elsewhere. We know that Paul quotes his opponents. And then if certain sections of 11, 2 to 16 are Pauline, that creates problems with other parts of his own letter. So just as an example, if he's saying, women, you got to cover your head because of the angels, you don't want to offend them. In 1 Corinthians 4:9, you bring this out in the book, Paul says, for I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, as those sentenced by death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to mortals. So Paul is saying we've been the lowest of the low as apostles, and that's our status marker, and that we're humiliated even before angels. And he doesn't seem to worry about that.
No, precisely. And then so the other thing you asked me about, how I arrived at different decisions, and the other thing about Paul addressing men is that he also is addressing the honor shame culture. So this was the other big. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the other biggest sticking points for me, was that I'd read these commentators, a massive consensus that Paul is dealing with the honor shame culture in a way of deconstructing it, like saying, look, I'm shamed as an apostle. He lived in shame, and he thought that was his honor, that he lived in shame. So
my chains, they are.
So then to implement a cultural system of honor and shame in the middle of the church to do with men and women, I thought that's really, really
ass backwards.
Yeah. So I didn't buy it. I mean, I don't buy it. And one of the things that I think is that I may not be right. I don't say in my book, this is definitely exactly what's going on in the passage. But if Michael's right, it's deeply worrying, really, and he knows that, because we have a text in the middle of our Bibles that is really, really theologically disparaging to women, and demeaning of women. But if I'm right, then I've rescued Paul and rescued women. If neither of us is right, then we've really got to go dig back into this passage, because the current explanations are incoherent. They don't work. They're not really, really wrestling with the problems that the passage presents us with. And I think that's one of my frustrations really with the scholarship, is that I think that people are not actually letting the text tell them what it's saying and dealing with that.
Yeah. Well, and you've highlighted in your book how even early church theologians recognized that there were some potential theological problems with this passage that they had to deal with and address.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Augustine, he's the great example of that, because so verses 7 to 9 they're the highly problematic verses, and because that's
where it talks about the woman being the image of man.
Yeah. And so it is common to read those verses, and to say, well, is he really saying that woman's not the glory, not the image and glory? And so other people have tried to make it into a sort of compliment for women. You're like the crowning glory of a man. I'm really not convinced by that.
It's not very enticing.
No, and I just don't think that's what it's saying. The reason, because it's the reason given for the woman having to wear a head covering. It's not, so. You're the crowning glory of the man, and if glory is displayed by not wearing head covering, then why isn't your glory, even if that was true, then why aren't you released from wearing head covering as well? So that your glory, the man's glory through you, can be manifest.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's all anyway.
It doesn't quite work.
No,
yeah.
It doesn't work. So Augustine, I mean, it's really worth reading on the Trinity. It's book 12. He does a very detailed exposition of this, and it's great. It's so sort of baroque in its explanation of how this is telling you that women are subordinate, but they're not really. So he tries to get out of it in his own particular way. But the anthropology that he's working with is so alien to how we understand male and female relations that it's anyway, it's a fascinating study for us in how people received it.
On the basis of your work, what's the main takeaway that you'd like for women in the church? Actually, I'd like to hear you say, what would you like women to hear from this, and what do you want men to hear from what you've written?
And going back to your original question, you asked me how women respond to this, but I've had some very strong reactions from men as well who really struggle with these texts. So it's not just the women. The takeaway for me would be that I think Paul is a champion of women. So that was, and really the reason I went into the whole study of women, it wasn't women, it was Paul. So Paul, because I loved Paul's writings, and so I definitely went in with an agenda of, I'm sure he's saying something positive, and I guess that's had its own consequences. But I really do think he is saying positive things to women. And I think that his ministry, the history of his ministry backs that up. So it's not just me and a whole bunch of other people saying, oh, we think Paul was favourable to women. We can see that Paul was favourable to women because he promoted them to positions of leadership and authority and responsibility, and clearly thought extremely highly of them and speaks of them as his co-workers and sisters, etc., in the same breath as the men. So I don't think he saw any difference between his female colleagues and his male colleagues, and so I think it's great to be able to read the text that people assume where he suddenly says, oh, no, but you should actually just be sitting down quietly and doing this and that and wearing your head covering, to read them in an opposite way and say it wasn't him, it was the Corinthians. And of course, Paul being Paul was releasing women into all that God has for them. And I think that's who he was.
And what would you like men to hear?
I'd like men to hear that this is part of the gospel, and that I've taught this a lot, and I find that a lot of men actually, it frees them from a way of relating to women that they weren't really comfortable with in the first place. And not everyone, but really the majority. I don't think that most men want women to be submissive and subordinate to them, and so they're just massively relieved because what they knew in their heart, in their spirits or whatever, is suddenly it's suddenly endorsed and affirmed by Scripture, rather than them feeling they're living in some sort of tension with the Bible that they love and the women that they love.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today.
Thanks, Matt.
You've been listening to On Script, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.